Part 1. The Haunting Beginning. Picture this. You are walking through the crowded streets of ancient Rome in the year 67 AD. The forum hums with voices, merchants calling out prices, senators whispering behind marble columns, children darting between fountains. The smell of incense mixes with the iron tang of sacrifice drifting from a nearby temple. Rome is alive, restless, eternal. And then the crowd parts. Conversations hush, replaced by a ripple of murmurs. The emperor himself, Nero Claudius Caesar, strides through the square, flanked by guards in polished armor. At his side walks a figure draped in silk and glittering jewels, every movement carefully measured, every step rehearsed. To the casual eye, she seems a new empress, stunning, graceful, regal. But the whispers in the crowd betray the truth. They say the emperor's bride was once a boy named Sporus. They say this union is no love story but the shadow of one, born from obsession and madness. Some cover their mouths in shock. Others stare in fascination, unable to look away. Because what they are witnessing is not just a scandal. It is an abomination, a tragedy, and perhaps the most grotesque display of imperial power Rome has ever seen. This is not a story about simple decadence. It is about how absolute power can warp grief into delusion, reshape love into possession, and reduce a living human into a hollow reflection of another's fantasy. Sporus's tale is not widely told, yet once heard, it cannot be forgotten. It lingers like the chill of a ghost in an empty corridor. But before we can understand Sporus, the boy who became an empress, we must return to the heart of this tragedy's architect, Nero himself. He was not always a monster. When he first came to power at the tender age of 16, Rome dared to hope for a golden dawn. A boy emperor, charismatic and full of promise. For a moment, the empire believed it had found a ruler who could balance art with governance, spectacle with stability. The transformation of that boy into the man who would one day marry Sporus is the dark journey we are about to take. A journey through power and paranoia, beauty and violence, and the endless Roman appetite for theater, even when the play was written in blood. And so, as we walk with Nero through the forum, listening to the whispers rise like smoke, let us step into his world, a world where reality bent under the weight of his will, and where one boy's life was consumed in the emperor's impossible quest to resurrect the dead. Part 2. Nero's Golden Dawn. When Nero first ascended the throne in 54 AD, he was only 16 years old. Imagine the weight of it. 60 million subjects, hundreds of legions, a city that called itself the center of the world, now all resting in the hands of a teenager. And yet, to the astonishment of many, the empire did not collapse into chaos. In those first years, Rome saw something remarkable. A young ruler who seemed determined not to be another tyrant, but a benefactor. Nero reduced burdensome taxes, easing the strain on common citizens who for generations had carried the weight of imperial ambition on their backs. He funded games and spectacles, filling the amphitheaters with laughter and applause. He opened his palace to the people, walking among them, listening to their petitions. To many Romans, it felt as though a new golden age might truly be dawning. Even his eccentricities were tolerated, even celebrated. Nero adored the arts, not merely as a patron, but as a performer. He sang on stage, played the lyre, and acted in dramas, scandalizing the Senate, but captivating ordinary Romans who thrilled at the sight of an emperor breaking the wall between ruler and ruled. For the people, he was not only a sovereign, but a kind of celebrity. But beneath the surface, cracks began to spread. Absolute power, no matter how well-intentioned, is a dangerous inheritance. Nero lived in a palace of mirrors, surrounded by advisors too frightened to contradict him. Every smile he saw was calculated, every compliment designed to soothe his vanity. He began to believe his own myth, that he was not merely a ruler, but divinely chosen, an artist touched by the gods. And into this heady world of power and performance stepped a woman who would change everything, Poppaea Sabina. She was unlike anyone Nero had ever known. Born into wealth, Poppaea possessed both the beauty of a goddess and the cunning of a statesman. Her skin was said to gleam like marble, her eyes sharp with ambition. Unlike most women in the imperial court, she had no intention of remaining in the background. She spoke with authority, maneuvered with skill, and cultivated influence with precision. She was admired and feared in equal measure. At the time, Nero was already bound in marriage to Octavia, the dutiful daughter of the late Emperor Claudius. Octavia embodied Roman ideals of modesty and restraint, but her quiet virtue could not compete with Poppaea's radiance. Where Octavia avoided attention, Poppaea demanded it. Where Octavia bowed to tradition, Poppaea wielded defiance as a weapon. It began as an affair, one of many whispered scandals that fluttered through the palace halls. But for Nero, it quickly became something more dangerous. He was not simply attracted to Poppaea, he was enthralled, consumed. His heart, already vulnerable to flattery and fantasy, now belonged entirely to her. Advisors noticed the change. Senators grew uneasy. Even the people who once adored their emperor began to sense a shift in the winds. For when desire and power intertwine, history rarely records mercy. The stage was set. The boy who had promised Rome a golden dawn was drifting into shadows, guided by a woman who understood both his weaknesses and her own extraordinary allure. Together, they would ignite a story of passion, jealousy, and obsession, one that would end not in glory, but in blood. Part 3. Obsession with Poppaea. At first, the whispers of Nero's affair with Poppaea Sabina were nothing unusual. The Roman elite thrived on scandal. Adultery among the powerful was practically a form of entertainment. But what began as gossip soon revealed itself to be something far darker. Nero's fascination with Poppaea was no fleeting indulgence. It was an obsession that consumed him. He was captivated not only by her beauty, but by her presence. She was vivacious, commanding, unafraid to draw the eyes of an entire room. When Poppaea entered a banquet hall, conversation stalled, and all gazes drifted toward her. She knew the effect she had and used it with precision. To Nero, already hungry for adoration, she became a mirror reflecting the godlike image he longed to see in himself. But obsession demands sacrifice. Octavia, Nero's first wife, stood in the way. Their marriage had been a political necessity, binding Nero to the lineage of the beloved Claudius. Octavia was dutiful, reserved, and adored by the Roman people for her modesty. Yet her very virtues became her downfall. In comparison to Poppaea's dazzling ambition, Octavia seemed dull, lifeless, a shadow in Nero's court. The emperor began reshaping reality to suit his passion. First, he distanced himself from Octavia, isolating her within the palace. Then, in an act that shocked Rome, he divorced her outright, citing fabricated charges of infertility. The people protested, their voices echoing through the streets, but Nero was unmoved. His gaze was fixed on Poppaea, and nothing else mattered. The marriage that followed was unlike anything Rome had seen. Nero lavished Poppaea with gifts that emptied the treasury, silks from the East, pearls from India, perfumes from Arabia. He stationed guards around her at all times, not only for her protection, but to monitor her every glance, every interaction, ensuring no rival could steal even a fragment of her attention. He filled his private chambers with portraits and statues of her, so that even when she was absent, her presence surrounded him like a haunting. Ancient historians describe Nero during this period as dangerously possessive. His temper flared at the smallest perceived slight. If another man dared linger too long in conversation with Poppaea, Nero erupted in jealousy, sometimes with violence. His court lived in fear. forced to tiptoe around his moods, to pretend that this obsession was love rather than a storm threatening to consume them all. And yet, Poppaea was no passive victim. She understood the peril of her position, but also the power it granted her. Through Nero's devotion, she secured favors for her allies, positioned her family in seats of influence, and built a network of loyal supporters. She was intelligent, calculating, and willing to wield her beauty like a blade. But she also carried a fatal flaw. She was unafraid to challenge Nero. Unlike the sycophants who bent under his every whim, Poppaea spoke her mind. She critiqued his performances, debated his policies, and mocked his artistic ambitions when they fell short. In the theater of Rome, where emperors were treated like gods, this was both her strength and her danger. To defy Nero was to step onto a knife's edge, where the line between affection and destruction blurred. Their marriage was less a partnership than a firestorm, brilliant, consuming, and destined to burn out in tragedy. For what Nero called love was not love at all, but possession. And possessions, when they resist their owner's grasp, are often broken. Part 5. The appearance of Sporus. Sporus was likely no older than 14 or 15 when he first came into Nero's orbit. Born a slave within the imperial household, he had known nothing of the world beyond marble halls and gilded corridors. Like many boys raised in the service of emperors, he had been trained for administrative tasks, copying documents, carrying messages, learning the etiquette of court life. For a freedman, this path was considered a privilege. Freedmen of the imperial service often lived more comfortably than freeborn peasants, enjoying fine clothes, steady meals, and even the faint promise of advancement. But privilege in Rome was always fragile, tethered entirely to the whims of power. Sporus owed everything to the imperial household, and that meant he owned nothing of himself. He was a body in service to the emperor's will. What made him stand out was not his training, nor his wit, but his face. Ancient writers describe him as delicate, strikingly beautiful, with features so refined they blurred the lines of gender. Most uncanny of all, he bore a haunting resemblance to the dead empress, Poppaea Sabina. His eyes, his bone structure, perhaps even the tilt of his smile, these echoes of a woman lost too soon, were impossible for Nero to ignore. In Roman culture, likeness was no trivial matter. To resemble another was not merely coincidence. It suggested connection, even destiny. Statues of gods and emperors were carefully crafted so that resemblance itself became a symbol of authority. To see Poppaea's reflection in the face of a boy must have struck Nero not as chance, but as providence. When the emperor's gaze fell upon Sporus for the first time after Poppaea's death, it was as if a door opened in his fractured mind. Here, standing before him, was an opportunity to undo the irreversible, to resurrect what he himself had destroyed. The resemblance was so strong, some whispered, that Nero believed the spirit of Poppaea had returned in another form. But there was one problem. Sporus was not Poppaea. He was young, male, and alive in a way that could not match the idealized memory of the dead empress. For any other man, these differences would have been insurmountable. But Nero was not any other man. He was the emperor of Rome, a god in his own eyes, a man accustomed to bending the world until it matched his desires. If death itself had taken Poppaea from him, then he would challenge death by reshaping another soul to take her place. It began with small gestures, summoning Sporus more often, speaking to him with unusual familiarity, dressing him in robes finer than his station deserved. But the intention behind these acts soon became clear. Nero did not simply want Sporus near him. He wanted him transformed. This was the moment Sporus's fate was sealed. A boy who had grown up in gilded captivity would now be remade into the shadow of a dead woman. His life, his body, his identity, none of it would belong to him any longer. He was to become a vessel for the emperor's grief, a living doll carved into the likeness of lost love. What followed was not only one of the most grotesque abuses of imperial power, but also one of the most chilling explorations of how grief and obsession can devour reality itself. Part 6. The Transformation. Nero's grief had already shattered the boundaries of reason. With Sporus, he set out to do something Rome had never seen before, to take a living boy and remake him into the image of a dead empress. It was not enough for Sporus to dress like Poppaea or to play-act her mannerisms. Nero wanted permanence. He wanted the illusion of resurrection. So he summoned Rome's finest physicians, men trained in battlefield surgery, accustomed to staunching wounds with cauterizing irons and crude instruments, and gave them an unthinkable order. Sporus was to be physically altered, his body reshaped to reflect a feminine form. In the ancient world, such procedures were brutal. Anesthetics were primitive, antiseptics non-existent. The risk of infection was enormous, the pain unimaginable. To undergo it was to stand at the threshold of death. Sporus had no choice. Surrounded by guards, stripped of agency, he was held down as the physicians carried out their work. We cannot know the details. Historians recorded only the outcome, but the implications are chilling. This was not healing. This was mutilation in service of an emperor's fantasy. If Sporus survived, he would carry the scars not only on his body, but in his soul. But the transformation did not end with surgery. The emperor's household became a theater of erasure, every detail of Sporus's identity systematically overwritten. Seamstresses were ordered to create gowns tailored to his altered form, garments of shimmering silk that concealed what Nero wished to forget. Jewelers designed ornaments specifically for him, often reusing Poppaea's own jewels, chains of pearls, golden tiaras, pendants that had once adorned the empress now hanging around the neck of her ghost. Hairdressers labored for hours, curling and arranging Sporus's locks into elaborate styles copied from aristocratic matrons. Heated irons seared and shaped, while servants wove in ribbons and gems. Makeup artists instructed him in cosmetics, kohl to darken the eyes, rouge to color the cheeks, powders to soften masculine angles. Each application of paint and powder was another mask laid over the boy beneath. Even his voice and movements were not spared. Tutors drilled him in feminine gestures, how to glide rather than stride, how to fold his hands with grace, how to tilt his head just so in conversation. Voice coaches urged him to speak in higher tones, to adopt the lilting cadences expected of Roman women. Every word, every step, every glance was rehearsed, reshaped, forced. Imagine the horror of waking each day to find mirrors reflecting not yourself, but the carefully constructed ghost of another. For Sporus, every morning must have been a fresh assault on his sense of being. His name was slipping away. His body no longer obeyed him. His past was being buried beneath fabrics, jewels, and rituals that belonged not to him, but to a woman long dead. The court, meanwhile, watched in silence. Some whispered of blasphemy, others of madness. Yet none dared oppose the emperor. They clapped politely at the charade, offering compliments on Sporus's radiance, all the while suppressing their unease. In Rome, survival depended not on truth, but on performance. And here, performance was demanded at knife's edge. In the eyes of Nero, this was not cruelty, but devotion. He had destroyed Poppaea in rage, and now he believed he could conjure her anew. Sporus, to him, was no longer a boy. He was Sabina reborn, a second chance, a living proof that the emperor's will could defy even death. And thus, Sporus's humanity was systematically dismantled, piece by piece, until he was no longer himself, but a vessel, a doll, an echo. The stage was set for the next act in this grotesque theater, a wedding. Rome had seen its share of scandalous unions, emperors marrying their mistresses, senators abandoning noble wives for courtesans, even whispers of forbidden liaisons hidden behind villa walls. But nothing in the empire's long memory prepared it for what Nero unveiled next. The emperor declared that he would marry Sporus, not as a concubine, not as a private indulgence hidden in shadow, but in a full public ceremony, witnessed by the court, sanctified by ritual, and celebrated with the extravagance of a state event. The announcement alone must have rippled through Rome like a shockwave. A boy, a eunuch, forced into the image of Poppaea Sabina, was to be raised to the rank of empress. Some whispered that Nero had finally gone mad, that grief had broken his mind beyond repair. Others dared not question him, knowing well the fate of those who mocked the emperor's whims. The ceremony was staged with all the pomp of a traditional Roman wedding. The palace was draped in garlands of flowers, incense burned so heavily the air itself seemed perfumed, and musicians filled the halls with flutes and lyres. Sporus, dressed in a bridal gown of dazzling white silk embroidered with gold, was veiled just as a bride should be. Pearls gleamed in his hair, and jewels glimmered at his wrists and throat, many of them once belonging to Poppaea herself. Then came the most grotesque inversion of all. Nero himself donned the role of the groom. He stood beside Sporus before the gathered court, placing a ring upon his finger, reciting vows as though this were a sacred bond rather than a theater of grief and domination. Witnesses say Sporus played his part with silence, his face carefully composed, his movements those of a trained doll. Did he feel terror, despair, a numb resignation? History does not record his inner voice, only the outer mask demanded of him. To resist was impossible. To comply was survival. After the vows, as tradition dictated, the emperor lifted his bride's veil and kissed him before the assembly. The hall erupted in forced applause. Senators, generals, and courtiers cheered, their voices echoing against marble columns, each clap of their hands a performance of loyalty rather than joy. They knew well that any failure to celebrate might be read as treason. And so, with the empire watching, Sporus was no longer a boy, no longer himself. He was now, in title and in ritual, the Empress of Rome. The grotesque irony was not lost on anyone. Nero had killed Poppaea Sabina in a fit of rage, and now he had resurrected her through the body of another. What stood beside him at that altar was not a bride but a specter, a shadow bound in silk and gold, doomed to play a role written by madness. From that day forward, Sporus accompanied Nero in public as his wife. He dined at imperial banquets in the seat once reserved for Poppaea, addressed as Lady and Empress. He rode with Nero in chariots, his presence a constant reminder of the emperor's power to bend reality into grotesque shapes. To Rome, it was both spectacle and nightmare. To Sporus, it was a living prison. From the moment of the wedding, Sporus was no longer permitted to exist as himself. He was now Augusta, the Empress of Rome, a title that rang hollow even as it shackled him tighter to Nero's will. At banquets, he sat at the emperor's side in the seat once reserved for Poppaea Sabina. Servants approached him with deference, bowing low, addressing him as Domina, Lady. Foreign envoys and senators alike were forced to salute him as though he were truly the empress, their lips curling into polite lies while their eyes betrayed unease. To show disgust would have been suicide. To play along was survival. And so the empire indulged Nero's fantasy. But the performance did not end with public ceremonies. Behind palace walls, the theater continued. Nero insisted that Sporus accompany him everywhere, to chariot races, to gladiatorial games, even to religious sacrifices. Whenever Nero appeared in public, Sporus was there, draped in jewels, veiled in silks, the silent shadow of a woman who no longer existed. At night, the charade deepened into cruelty. Roman historians, with their taste for scandal, record that Nero would address Sporus tenderly as Sabina, whispering to him as though speaking to the dead. To the emperor, this was devotion. To Sporus, it was a prison of flesh and memory. Every word he spoke, every glance he gave, had to conform to the role of a ghost he never chose to embody. For the courtiers and senators forced to witness this farce, it became a grotesque entertainment. They whispered jokes in the shadows, calling Sporus the queen who was no woman, or mocking Nero for marrying his castrated boy. But always in whispers, always behind closed doors, for Nero's spies lurked everywhere, and laughter could cost a man his life. Yet there was another layer to this nightmare. Sporus, as empress, wielded no real power. Unlike true imperial consorts who might intercede in politics or patronize artists, he was an ornament, displayed but voiceless, elevated yet powerless. His crown was not authority, but humiliation, a reminder that even the highest seat in Rome could be transformed into a stage for cruelty. And through it all, Sporus endured. Day after day, he put on the silks, the jewels, the veil. He sat at Nero's side as the empire roared around them, a boy buried alive beneath layers of performance. His survival depended on obedience, his very existence reduced to the reflection of a woman long dead. For Nero, this living shadow of Poppaea was proof that his will could overcome even death. For Sporus, it was proof that there was no escape from the emperor's obsessions. But Rome was restless. Beyond the palaces, rebellions stirred, conspiracies spread, and whispers of Nero's downfall grew louder. The stage upon which Sporus was forced to play empress would not last forever. While Nero played emperor as though life were one endless theater, the real world outside his palace walls began to collapse. The treasury bled dry from his extravagances, the golden palaces, the endless feasts, the armies of performers hired to stage his fantasies. Taxes rose, and the provinces groaned beneath the weight. In the east, rebellions flared. In Judea, the Jewish revolt raged against Rome's legions. Even in Gaul and Hispania, whispers of discontent turned into shouts of defiance. But perhaps most dangerous of all were the whispers inside Rome itself. Senators plotted in secret. Generals calculated their loyalties. And the Praetorian Guard, the very body meant to protect the emperor, began to question whether their master was a god or a madman. Sporus, still trapped in the role of empress, lived in the eye of this storm. Wherever Nero went, he followed. Gilded banquets, drunken processions, absurd performances in which the emperor insisted on singing, acting, and even competing as a charioteer before jeering crowds. Each time Nero stepped onto a stage, Sporus was there beside him, dressed in jewels, applauding like the perfect imperial consort. But behind the applause, the mood of Rome had shifted. Once the people tolerated Nero's eccentricities in exchange for bread and spectacle. Now they muttered openly that the emperor was no artist, but a tyrant. His obsession with his bride became yet another scandal, a symbol of how far he had strayed from dignity. Imagine the sight. As soldiers marched to war and citizens starved in the streets, their emperor paraded through the city in golden robes, holding the hand of a boy dressed as his dead wife. It was theater, yes, but now it was theater played before an audience that no longer cared to clap. The conspiracies grew bolder. Senators aligned with generals. Generals whispered to their legions, and soon the empire itself seemed ready to turn. The year 68 AD would become infamous, the year the world finally rose against its emperor. And through it all, Sporus could not escape. He was bound to Nero's side, a jewel in the crown of madness, a living symbol of an emperor's grief turned to monstrosity. As Rome plotted Nero's downfall, Sporus must have wondered, if the empire could overthrow a god, what hope was there for the ghost chained to his throne? The end was coming, and Sporus would be dragged into it. By the summer of 68 AD, the empire was on fire, politically, if not literally. One by one, provinces rose in rebellion. In Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex declared Nero unfit to rule. In Hispania, Galba, governor of Tarraconensis, proclaimed himself emperor. Even the Praetorian Guard, Rome's supposed shield of loyalty, betrayed Nero for promises of gold. The city that once adored its young emperor now turned against him. Where once the people cheered his singing on stage, now they mocked him openly in the streets. Graffiti cursed his name. Senators sharpened their knives, ready to erase him from memory. The applause that had sustained his delusions had gone silent. Through this storm, Sporus remained by his side. The boy who had been remade into an empress now stood witness to an emperor unraveling. Nero, panicked and paranoid, clung to him more tightly than ever. He called Sporus his Sabina, his companion, his ghost bride, perhaps the only figure left in all of Rome who would not betray him. When news came that the Senate had declared him a public enemy, Nero fled the palace under cover of night. Imagine the scene, the most powerful man in the world sneaking out through a side gate with only a few loyal freedmen and slaves. Among them was Sporus, dragged into exile by the man who had stolen his name and body. They fled to a villa outside Rome, Nero dressed in shabby disguise, his face hidden beneath a hood. Sporus, once paraded in silks and jewels, now followed him in silence, stripped of the hollow glamour that had defined his captivity. There, in the shadows of the villa, Nero's fear consumed him. He begged his companions to dig him a grave in advance. He clutched treasures, as if gold could save him. He muttered to Sporus, calling him by Poppaea's name, speaking of death as though it were a wedding they were about to share. And then the final news arrived. Galba's legions were marching. The Senate had condemned him. The Praetorians had deserted. Rome no longer belonged to Nero. With enemies closing in, Nero faced a choice: humiliation or death. To be captured meant public execution, his body paraded, his name spat upon. He could not endure it. And so, in June of 68 AD, the emperor who had demanded to be worshipped as a god, the man who had made Rome his stage, pressed a dagger to his own throat. Hesitating, trembling, he begged for help. It was his secretary, Epaphroditus, who finally guided the blade home. As Nero fell, it was Sporus who stood nearby, a silent witness to the emperor's last act. The boy who had been forced to live as a ghost now watched the Ghostmaker die. With Nero's final breath, the empire lurched into chaos, the year of the 4 emperors. For Sporus, freedom did not come with his master's death. His fate would be bound to the ambitions of new rulers, each eager to seize the throne and each seeing in him a twisted prize. The tragedy was not over. Nero was gone, but Sporus's torment did not end with his master's death. If anything, his fate grew more grotesque. In the chaos that followed, the year of the 4 emperors, Sporus became a strange, living relic of the fallen dynasty. He was not merely a boy, not merely a eunuch. He was the shadow of Poppaea Sabina, the empress who had walked beside Nero, a symbol so potent that Rome's new rulers saw in him a tool. First came Otho, once a friend of Nero and rumored lover of Poppaea herself before Nero claimed her. To Otho, Sporus was not a victim, but a prize, a twisted link to both the woman he once desired and the emperor who had stolen her. Taking Sporus into his household, Otho treated him with a grotesque tenderness, calling him Sabina, dressing him in the same finery Nero had once demanded. Once again, Sporus was forced to play the role of wife, this time to the man who had lost Poppaea to Nero's jealousy years before. The cycle of possession was complete. Sporus was no longer a person in the eyes of power, but a mirror in which men sought the ghosts of their obsessions. But Otho's reign was brief. After only 3 months, he was gone, another casualty in the whirlpool of civil war. And with each change of emperor, Sporus was passed along, his identity erased, his body traded like treasure. Then came Vitellius. Where Nero had been theatrical, where Otho had been nostalgic, Vitellius was cruel. He looked upon Sporus not as an empress or a ghost, but as a curiosity, a toy for mockery. History whispers of his darkest plan, that Sporus should be forced to play the role of Poppaea one final time, this time not in a wedding, but in a grotesque parody of death. Vitellius plotted to have Sporus dressed in bridal garments, paraded before the public, and then violated in a spectacle of cruelty, a wedding to death, staged for Rome's amusement. For Sporus, who had endured humiliation upon humiliation, this was the breaking point. To be displayed, defiled, destroyed before the eyes of the city, it was a fate worse than anything he had survived. And so, before the plan could be carried out, Sporus made his final choice. He took his own life, ending the performance on his own terms. The boy who had been renamed, reshaped, and erased, who had been forced to live as the ghost of another, at last claimed something for himself. An end. Rome moved on. New emperors rose and fell, New scandals replaced the old. But the story of Sporus lingers, a shadow in the annals of history. His life was not his own. It was stolen, rewritten, performed for the desires of others. Yet in death, he reclaimed the only role he was ever allowed to choose. The tragedy of Sporus is not just the cruelty of Nero or the corruption of Rome. It is the story of a boy consumed by an empire's obsession, remembered only as a ghost he never wished to be. The tale of Sporus is not a story of triumph. It is not even truly his story, at least not as history records it. The chroniclers of Rome wrote of him not as a person, but as an object of ridicule, a scandal, a footnote in the lives of emperors. His own voice is forever lost. What survives are fragments. A boy renamed, a body remade, a life consumed by the obsessions of men more powerful than him. Nero saw in him the ghost of a wife he could not let go. Otho saw the echo of a love stolen. Vitellius saw an opportunity for cruelty. And Rome itself, the senators, the courtiers, the mob, saw him as entertainment, a grotesque theater staged on the body of a child. Yet behind those fragments lies the unbearable truth. Sporus was real. He laughed once. He dreamed once. He feared and hoped like anyone else. But history swallowed him whole, reducing him to a shadow. The tragedy of Sporus is not only that he was mutilated, humiliated, paraded, and used. It is that his humanity was denied him at every turn. To Nero, he was Sabina. To Otho, Sabina. To Vitellius, a spectacle. Never Sporus, never himself. And so, his life becomes a mirror for Rome itself. An empire so drunk on power that it devoured the lives of those caught in its grip. In the palaces of emperors, people became symbols, bodies became tools, and grief curdled into cruelty. But perhaps there is one final act of defiance in Sporus's story. In choosing death on his own terms, he broke the script. No longer would he be a puppet in Rome's theater. His silence, his refusal, became the only voice history could not take from him. Today, when we look back, we do not remember Nero's performances, Otho's nostalgia, or Vitellius's cruelty. We remember Sporus, the boy forced to live as a ghost. And in remembering him not as an empress, not as a parody, but as a person, perhaps we return to him the one thing Rome denied, his name. Sporus. Not Sabina, not empress, not spectacle, just Sporus.